The crystal chandeliers of Sterling Tower's grand ballroom cast prismatic rainbows across the marble floors, illuminating a sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. At the podium, Olivia Sterling commanded the room with her platinum blonde waves, catching the light like spun gold, her voice cutting through the murmur of Manhattan's elite. The annual Sterling Global Gala was in full swing when chaos erupted. A figure in black burst through the service entrance, weapon raised, charging directly toward the stage. Bodyguards froze. Guests screamed. And then, impossibly, a janitor in a worn gray uniform stepped between the gun and the CEO, his mop bucket clattering to the floor as he spread his arms wide. Ethan Carter's eyes blazed with fierce determination as he shouted the words that would echo through history. "I'm not afraid of you." The gunshot cracked like thunder through the ballroom. He was only a janitor, a struggling single dad. But this night, his courage would uncover secrets, ignite love, and shake the world upside down. Ethan Carter had never intended to be a hero. At 36, he measured his life in small victories. Getting Lily to school on time, keeping the electricity on, managing another night shift without falling asleep on his feet. The fluorescent lights of Sterling Tower had become as familiar to him as the sunrise he rarely saw anymore. Working from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, pushing his cart through endless corridors of corporate power he'd never possess. His calloused hands knew every inch of marble that needed polishing, every brass fixture that required attention, every glass surface that bore the fingerprints of people who never noticed him passing by. 3 years had passed since cancer took Sarah, leaving him to raise their daughter alone. And in those 3 years, he'd learned that dignity wasn't found in titles or bank accounts but in showing up, day after day, doing what needed to be done. Lily Carter was the sun in Ethan's universe, a 7-year-old force of nature with her mother's hazel eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She drew pictures of him in crayon, always depicting him with a cape, standing tall against monsters and dragons, her childish scrawl labeling him Daddy the Hero in purple marker. She didn't know that heroes sometimes cried in bathroom stalls during lunch breaks, overwhelmed by medical bills and rent notices. She didn't know that her father's back ached constantly from bending over mop buckets, or that he sometimes ate only crackers for dinner so she could have a proper meal. All Lily knew was that her daddy tucked her in every morning before school, his uniform smelling of industrial cleaner and exhaustion, and that his hugs could chase away any nightmare. She believed in him with the fierce certainty that only children possess, and Ethan carried that belief like armor against a world that had forgotten to be kind. Olivia Sterling inhabited a different universe entirely, one constructed of glass and steel and quarterly projections. At 34, she was the youngest CEO in Sterling Global's history, inheriting not just a company, but a legacy of ruthless efficiency that her father, Richard Sterling, had built over 4 decades. Her office occupied the entire 50th floor, its windows offering a view of Manhattan that made visitors feel like gods looking down on mortals. She wore her isolation like Armani, tailored perfectly to hide the woman beneath the executive. Her days began at 5 in the morning with international calls and ended long after midnight with reports and strategies, leaving no room for the life other people seemed to live so effortlessly. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford, friendship a liability in a world where everyone wanted something from her. The platinum blonde hair that photographers loved to capture was styled to perfection each morning by 5:30, her makeup applied like war paint for battles fought in boardrooms, where showing weakness meant losing everything. Richard Sterling had carved his empire from stone and spite, rising from nothing to become one of Manhattan's most feared corporate titans. At 65, he viewed the world through the lens of conquest and control, seeing people as either assets or obstacles. His daughter was his greatest creation, molded and shaped into the perfect successor, though he secretly resented that he'd never had a son. Richard's philosophy was simple. Power was the only truth that mattered, and sentiment was a disease that infected the weak. He'd arranged Olivia's life like a chess match, eliminating anyone who might distract her from the throne he'd built. The janitor who'd saved her life was an aberration, a glitch in the matrix of his carefully constructed world. Men like Ethan Carter weren't supposed to matter, weren't supposed to be noticed, and certainly weren't supposed to step into the spotlight reserved for their betters. Damian Cross represented everything Richard Sterling admired, and Olivia Sterling instinctively distrusted. At 40, He cut an impressive figure in his silver-tailored suits, his blonde hair slicked back with precision that matched his calculating gray eyes. The diamond watch on his wrist cost more than Ethan made in 5 years, and he made sure everyone knew it. As Sterling Global's chief operations officer, Damien had positioned himself as Richard's protege, the son he'd never had, though his ambitions reached far beyond playing second fiddle to anyone. His office on the 48th floor was a monument to minimalist intimidation, all sharp edges and cold surfaces, reflecting the man who inhabited it. Damien smiled with his mouth, but never his eyes, and his handshake felt like a trap about to spring. He moved through the corporate world like a shark through dark water, patient and predatory, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The gala attack had shattered more than just the evening's festivities. In the aftermath, as paramedics tended to Ethan's grazed shoulder where the bullet had torn through his uniform, Olivia found herself staring at a man she'd passed 100 times without seeing. Blood seeped through the gray fabric, staining it dark, but Ethan's concern was only for her safety. Asking repeatedly if she was hurt, while refusing to sit down until the paramedics forced him. The media descended like vultures, their cameras capturing the impossible image. Manhattan's ice queen kneeling beside a janitor, her designer gown stained with his blood, her perfectly manicured hands pressed against his wound. The headline wrote itself. Minimum wage hero saves, billionaire CEO. But Olivia saw something the cameras couldn't capture: the way Ethan's eyes had held no fear, only determination, the way he'd moved without hesitation, as if protecting her was as natural as breathing. The investigation into the attack revealed troubling patterns. This wasn't a random act of violence, but a carefully orchestrated attempt. The gunman, a hired professional who'd somehow obtained security codes and schedules. Olivia threw herself into uncovering the truth with the same intensity she applied to hostile takeovers. But her investigation led her repeatedly back to Ethan Carter, not as a suspect, but as a puzzle she couldn't solve. Why had he risked everything for someone who'd never even known his name? Her security team uncovered his background. Widowed father, former construction worker sidelined by an injury, taking any job he could find to support his daughter. She discovered he worked 2 other part-time jobs on weekends, that he'd sold his car to pay for his wife's final medical bills, that he lived in a 2-room apartment in Queens, where the heat barely worked. The more she learned, the more she realized that Ethan Carter possessed something all her wealth couldn't buy. The ability to see what truly mattered. 3 days after the gala, another attempt was made. This time, it was a suspicious package delivered to Olivia's office. Caught only because Ethan, returning to work despite his injury, noticed something off about the delivery man's uniform, a detail that had escaped the security team's scrutiny. His warning saved not just Olivia, but her entire executive staff from what the bomb squad later confirmed was enough explosive to level 3 floors. The media couldn't get enough of the story, the janitor who'd become an unlikely guardian angel. But for Ethan, the attention was agony. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted to do his job and get home to Lily. Yet something had shifted in the building's atmosphere. Olivia had started acknowledging him, stopping to ask about his shoulder, about his daughter. Small gestures that shouldn't have mattered, but somehow changed everything. The danger escalated when Lily became an unintended target. Someone had been watching Ethan's apartment, following his routines, learning about his daughter. The discovery came when Lily mentioned to her father that a nice man in a silver suit had approached her at school, asking questions about her daddy's work. Ethan's blood turned to ice. He recognized the description immediately. Damien Cross. The implication was clear: his daughter was leverage, a pressure point to be exploited. When Ethan brought this information to Olivia, her reaction surprised him. The controlled CEO, who never showed emotion, suddenly looked terrified. Not for herself, but for the innocent child being dragged into corporate warfare. She immediately arranged for private security for Lily, overriding Ethan's protests about charity with a fierce declaration that protecting the innocent wasn't charity but basic human decency. Trust grew between them in unexpected ways. Olivia began timing her late-night work sessions to coincide with Ethan's shifts, finding excuses to walk the halls when he was cleaning. Their conversations started simply discussions about the building's security, observations about the company's vulnerabilities. But gradually, they deepened. Ethan spoke about Sarah, about the dreams they'd shared before illness stole their future. Olivia admitted things she'd never told anyone. Her mother's death when she was 12, her father's transformation from loving parent to cold strategist, her fear that she was becoming exactly what he'd designed her to be. These midnight confessions, shared in empty conference rooms, while Ethan mopped and Olivia pretended to review reports, created a bond that transcended their different worlds. Ethan struggled with feelings he couldn't afford to have. Olivia Sterling wasn't just out of his league. She existed in a different stratosphere entirely. He was a janitor with a 7th-grade daughter, living paycheck to paycheck, wearing shoes held together with superglue. She was corporate royalty, her shoes worth more than his annual salary, her world one of private jets and board meetings he couldn't even comprehend. Yet when she looked at him, really looked at him, he saw something in her eyes that had nothing to do with pity or charity. He saw recognition, as if she'd been searching for something her whole life, and had finally found it in the last place she'd expected. But what could he offer her except complications? His life was Lily, work, and survival. There was no room for fairy tales, no matter how much his daughter believed in them. Olivia faced her own internal war. Everything her father had taught her screamed that Ethan Carter was wrong for her image, her position, her carefully constructed life. Richard had already made his displeasure clear, calling Ethan's heroics the desperate attention-seeking of the lower classes. He demanded she distance herself, maintain professional boundaries, remember who she was and what she represented. But for the first time in her life, Olivia found herself questioning everything her father said. Ethan had shown more genuine courage in one moment than she'd witnessed in decades of boardroom battles. He asked for nothing, expected nothing, and yet gave everything when it mattered. His integrity illuminated the moral compromises she'd accepted as normal, the casual cruelties of her world that she'd been trained to ignore. Richard Sterling's fury grew with each passing day that his daughter maintained contact with the janitor. He saw Ethan as a contamination, a virus, threatening to weaken the steel he'd forged Olivia into. During a private dinner at his penthouse, he laid down an ultimatum: end this inappropriate association or face consequences. Olivia, for perhaps the first time in her life, defied him directly. The argument that followed shook the foundations of their relationship. Richard accused her of throwing away everything he'd built for a meaningless infatuation. Olivia accused him of trying to control her life like she was another corporate asset. The dinner ended with Richard's chilling warning that he would do whatever was necessary to protect the Sterling legacy, even if it meant protecting Olivia from herself. The night everything changed started with rain hammering against the windows of Sterling Tower. Olivia had stayed late, wrestling with a hostile takeover bid that required her full attention. Ethan was working 3 floors down, the building nearly empty except for essential staff. The first sign of trouble was the elevators simultaneously shutting down, trapping anyone trying to leave. Then the lights flickered and died, emergency power failing to engage. In the darkness, Olivia heard footsteps that didn't belong. Multiple sets moving with military precision through the hallways. Her security detail had been mysteriously called away an hour earlier, on a false alarm. She was alone, her phone dead, the panic button on her desk unresponsive. But she wasn't alone for long. Ethan appeared like a ghost from the stairwell, having climbed 17 flights in the dark, somehow knowing she was in danger. Their flight through the building became a desperate game of cat and mouse. Ethan's knowledge of every service corridor, every maintenance shaft, every hidden passage that the cleaning crew used, became their salvation. He guided Olivia through paths she never knew existed in her own building, his hand steady in hers, as they navigated by touch and instinct. Behind them, the hunters grew closer, their voices echoing through empty offices. When they finally reached the loading dock, Ethan hotwired a delivery van with skills learned in a youth he rarely discussed. They burst onto the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, the city lights blurring through water-streaked windows as Ethan drove with controlled desperation, taking turns that made Olivia's stomach lurch but kept their pursuers at bay. They abandoned the van in Chinatown, disappearing into the maze of narrow alleys and steam-filled streets. Ethan led her to places invisible to her world, a laundromat where the owner owed him a favor, a network of connected basements that ran beneath entire blocks, finally emerging at an all-night diner in Queens, where the waitress called him by name, and didn't ask questions about the terrified-looking blonde woman in a designer suit, clinging to his arm. In a cracked vinyl booth, over coffee that tasted like motor oil and pie that was surprisingly good, they talked through the night. Olivia's hands shook as she held the chipped mug, the adrenaline finally catching up. She admitted something she'd never said aloud. She'd never felt safe. Not really. Not even as a child. Her whole life had been about projecting strength, while feeling constantly under siege. But with Ethan, in this dingy diner with fluorescent lights flickering overhead, she felt something she'd thought was just a myth. Protected. Ethan's phone, a battered flip phone that still worked when smartphones failed, became their lifeline. He called his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, confirming Lily was safe, staying the night there as planned. Then he made another call, to a friend from his construction days who worked in private security, someone who owed him no loyalty to the Sterling Empire. What they learned in the next hour shattered Olivia's world. The attacks hadn't been orchestrated by corporate rivals or hostile takeover attempts. The trail led back to Richard Sterling himself, working with Damien Cross to create controlled chaos, manufactured threats designed to test Olivia's strength and justify increasingly draconian security measures that would isolate her completely. Her own father had been terrorizing her to maintain control, using fear as a leash to keep her bound to him. The evidence was damning. Financial transfers hidden beneath layers of shell companies, communications routed through encrypted channels that Ethan's friend had somehow accessed, recorded conversations between Richard and Damien, planning each escalation. The gunman at the gala had been instructed to create drama without real danger except Ethan's intervention, had turned a controlled scenario into genuine chaos. Richard had been furious about the janitor's involvement, seeing it as a variable he couldn't control. Every subsequent attempt had been designed to either eliminate Ethan or drive him away. To restore the narrative Richard wanted, his daughter alone, dependent, shaped by fear into the perfect successor who would never question, never rebel, never leave. Olivia broke. Not the controlled tears of boardroom frustrations or the hidden crying in executive bathrooms, but a complete shattering of everything she'd believed about her life. Her father, the man who'd raised her, who'd claimed every cruel lesson was for her own good, had been her tormentor. Every moment of fear, every sleepless night, every paranoid glance over her shoulder, had been orchestrated by the one person who was supposed to protect her. Ethan held her in that diner booth as she sobbed, his arms the only solid thing in a world that had turned to quicksand. He didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. He just held her, letting her grieve the father she'd thought she had, the life she'd thought she was living. Dawn was breaking when they finally left the diner, the rain having stopped, leaving the streets washed clean and gleaming. They couldn't go to the police. Richard Sterling owned too many people, had too much influence. But Olivia had resources of her own. Contacts in the FBI who investigated corporate corruption. Journalists who'd been waiting years for evidence against Richard Sterling. As they stood on a Queens street corner, the Manhattan skyline visible in the distance, Olivia made the hardest decision of her life. She would destroy her father to save herself, and to protect Ethan and Lily from becoming collateral damage in Richard's war for control. The plan required them to return to Sterling Tower, to act as if nothing had changed, while secretly gathering the final pieces of evidence. Olivia would attend the emergency board meeting Richard had called, playing the part of the shaken but determined CEO. Ethan would return to his janitorial duties, his presence a calculated insult to Richard's sensibilities. But Richard and Damien had anticipated this move. They'd prepared a final solution, one that would eliminate all problems permanently. If Olivia wouldn't be controlled, she would be replaced. The company had succession protocols, contingencies for if something happened to the CEO, and if the janitor and his daughter were caught in the crossfire, well, that was just unfortunate collateral damage in the war for corporate supremacy. The trap was set in the building's underground parking garage. Lily had been brought to the building under the pretense of visiting her father at work, a special treat arranged by Olivia's office. But it was Damien who met them at the service entrance, his silver suit immaculate, his smile sharp as a blade. Mrs. Chen, who'd brought Lily, sensed something wrong immediately. But Damien's security team was already moving. herding them toward a black SUV. Lily's scream echoed through the concrete cavern, a sound that reached Ethan 5 floors up and sent him running with a desperation that ignored his still-healing shoulder, his exhaustion, everything except the need to reach his daughter. Olivia was in the board meeting when her phone vibrated with the emergency alert Ethan had sent. She looked across the polished table at her father, saw the satisfaction in his eyes, and understood. This was the endgame. Richard had orchestrated everything to reach this moment. Olivia would either submit completely, accepting his control, or lose everything she'd come to care about. But Richard had miscalculated. He'd assumed Olivia was still the daughter he'd shaped, driven by ambition and self-preservation. He didn't understand that Ethan had shown her something more powerful than fear, the courage to choose love over safety. The confrontation in the parking garage became the stuff of legend, captured on security cameras that would later be played in courtrooms and news broadcasts around the world. Ethan burst from the stairwell, just as Damien was forcing Lily into the vehicle. There was no hesitation, no calculation of odds. A father protecting his child doesn't consider consequences. Ethan hit Damien with the force of every fear, every frustration, every moment of feeling powerless in a world that favored men like him. They crashed into concrete pillars, rolled across oil-stained floors, a brutal fight between David and Goliath, where David's desperation made him dangerous. Damien pulled a gun, the same model used at the gala, a detail that would later prove significant in court. But as he raised it toward Ethan, Olivia's voice rang out across the garage. She stood at the entrance, flanked not by corporate security but by FBI agents, their weapons trained on Damien and his team. The siege was over. But Damien, cornered and desperate, made one last play. He swung the gun toward Lily, using the child as leverage for escape. The moment froze, suspended in time like amber. Then Ethan moved, not away from danger but into it, placing himself between the gun and his daughter with the same instinctive protection he'd shown at the gala. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Ethan felt the impact, like a sledgehammer to his chest, driving him backward. He heard Lily screaming, heard Olivia's voice breaking as she called his name, heard the thunder of tactical boots as FBI agents swarmed Damien, but all he could focus on was Lily's face, making sure she was unharmed, that the blood spreading across his shirt was only his. He tried to speak, to tell her it would be okay. But darkness was creeping in from the edges of his vision. The last thing he heard was Olivia saying words he'd never dared hope for. "I love you. Please don't leave me. I love you." The next days blurred between consciousness and dreams. Ethan woke in a private hospital room that looked more like a luxury hotel, machines beeping steadily, pain a constant companion despite the medication. Lily was there, curled in a chair beside his bed, her small hand holding his while she slept. Olivia was there too, still in the same clothes from the garage, her perfect appearance destroyed, her eyes red from crying. She'd refused to leave. The nurses told him later, had threatened to buy the entire hospital if they tried to make her go. The bullet had missed his heart by inches, collapsing a lung but failing to do the fatal damage Damien had intended. He would recover, they assured him, though it would take time. The media explosion was immediate and overwhelming. The security footage, released as part of the FBI investigation, showed everything. Ethan's fearless protection of his daughter, Olivia's arrival with federal agents, the takedown of Damien Cross. But more importantly, it revealed Richard Sterling in the background, watching from his limousine, making no move to stop the violence until the FBI surrounded his vehicle. The subsequent investigation uncovered years of corporate corruption, manipulation, and orchestrated violence. Richard Sterling, the titan of industry, was arrested in his own boardroom, led away in handcuffs as cameras captured his fall from grace. Damien Cross faced attempted murder charges, along with conspiracy and corruption. The Sterling empire shook to its foundations. Olivia took control with an iron fist wrapped in velvet gloves. She called a press conference that became the most watched corporate announcement in history. Standing at the podium where the first attack had occurred, she didn't speak about quarterly earnings or strategic partnerships. She spoke about courage, about a janitor who'd shown her what real strength looked like. "Ethan Carter didn't just save my life," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. He showed me what it means to truly live. He taught me that integrity isn't about your bank account or your job title. It's about standing up when it matters, protecting those who need protection, choosing love over fear, even when the cost is everything. She announced massive changes to Sterling Global: living wages for all employees, comprehensive health care, education funds for employees' children. The janitor who'd saved the CEO would become the blueprint for how the company treated all its workers. Lily became a celebrity despite Ethan's attempts to shield her from attention. Her drawings of her father as a superhero were published in newspapers. Her innocent quotes about Daddy being the bravest in the whole world melting hearts across social media. But more importantly, she finally had what she'd always wanted. Her father recognized as the hero she'd always known him to be. When Ethan was released from the hospital, they found their small Queens apartment transformed. Olivia had paid off the building's mortgage and renovated not just their unit, but the entire complex, ensuring every family had heat, proper plumbing, and dignity. It wasn't charity, she insisted. It was justice. The relationship between Ethan and Olivia became Manhattan's favorite fairy tale, though the reality was more complex than any story. They came from different worlds, spoke different languages of power and privilege. But in the quiet moments, when Olivia helped Lily with homework while Ethan cooked dinner in their new apartment, when they walked through Central Park with Lily between them, when Olivia fell asleep on Ethan's shoulder while watching old movies, the differences didn't matter. Love had its own logic, its own mathematics that didn't care about social hierarchies or bank balances. Richard Sterling's trial became a sensation, the fallen king facing justice for crimes that went back decades. His defense tried to paint him as a protective father, driven to extremes by love for his daughter. But Olivia's testimony destroyed that narrative. She spoke about years of manipulation, control disguised as care, fear marketed as strength. She revealed how her father had isolated her from anyone who might show her a different way of living, how he'd used her mother's death to reshape her into his image. When she finished testifying, she walked past Richard without looking at him, Ethan's hand steady in hers, Lily walking beside them. The jury's verdict was swift and decisive, guilty on all counts. Richard Sterling would spend his remaining years in federal prison, his empire dismantled, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the corruption of power. Damian Cross's cooperation with prosecutors, a desperate attempt to reduce his sentence, revealed even more about the corporate underworld Richard had created. Shell companies laundering money, bribes to regulators, a network of corruption that touched dozens of other corporations. The investigation expanded, taking down a whole ecosystem of corporate criminals who'd thought themselves untouchable. Ethan's simple act of courage had started an avalanche that reshaped Manhattan's business landscape. The janitor who just wanted to protect his daughter had inadvertently become the catalyst for the largest corporate reform in decades. 6 months after the shooting, Sterling Global held another gala. This time, Ethan wasn't cleaning the floors, he was walking them as an honored guest. Lily, in a new dress, Olivia had helped her pick out. His own suit feeling strange but not uncomfortable. The same people who'd never noticed him before now wanted to shake his hand, to be photographed with the hero janitor. But Ethan's attention was only on Olivia as she took the stage. She wore a simple black dress instead of her usual designer gowns, her speech different from the corporate rhetoric of before. She talked about transformation, about learning to see people instead of positions, about the courage of ordinary individuals who do extraordinary things. Then she did something unprecedented. She called Ethan and Lily onto the stage. The audience held its breath as Olivia Sterling, the Ice Queen CEO who'd never shown public emotion, knelt down to Lily's level. "Your daddy saved me," she told the little girl, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Not just from danger, but from a life without real love. Is it okay if I love him too?" Lily's response, broadcast across the world, was simple and perfect. "Only if you promise to make him happy. He deserves to be happy." The crowd erupted as Olivia stood, taking Ethan's hand, their first public kiss captured by 100 cameras, but belonging only to them. The changes at Sterling Global rippled outward, inspiring other corporations to examine their treatment of workers. The Ethan Carter Initiative became a model for corporate reform, proving that treating employees with dignity and respect actually improved productivity and profits. Olivia became a different kind of CEO, one who knew the names of her janitors, who ate lunch in the employee cafeteria, who measured success not just in stock prices but in the lives improved. She kept Ethan's old mop bucket in her office, a reminder of the night everything changed, of the moment a janitor's courage saved more than just her life. Ethan returned to work, but not as a janitor. Olivia had offered him any position he wanted, but he chose something unexpected: Director of Workplace Safety and Employee Advocacy. He became the voice for the workers who'd been invisible, the bridge between the executive floor and the ground level. His office, modest compared to the executive suites, became a sanctuary for employees facing problems, from workplace injuries to family crises. He implemented programs that seemed revolutionary but were really just common sense: emergency funds for employees facing medical bills, flexible schedules for single parents, on-site childcare that allowed parents to work without worry. Lily thrived in her new life, though Ethan made sure she stayed grounded. She still attended public school, still did chores, still understood that money wasn't what made people valuable. But she also had opportunities she'd never dreamed of: art classes with real artists, visits to museums and theaters, travels to places she'd only seen in books. Most importantly, she had a father who no longer came home exhausted and defeated but energized and proud. And she had Olivia, who became not a replacement for her mother but a new kind of love, someone who read her stories and taught her about strength that had nothing to do with physical courage. The wedding was small by Manhattan standards, held not in a cathedral but in the community center in Queens, where Ethan had spent summers as a child. Lily was the flower girl, Mrs. Chen the matron of honor, and Ethan's construction crew friends the groomsmen. Olivia's side was smaller, a few true friends who'd stood by her through the scandal, colleagues who'd supported her transformation of the company. Richard Sterling wasn't invited, though he sent a letter from prison that Olivia burned unread. The media was barred, though photos leaked anyway: the billionaire CEO in a simple white dress, the former janitor in a rented tux, and a little girl beaming between them like sunshine. Their life together wasn't a fairy tale, it was better because it was real. They fought about normal things: Ethan's insistence on doing his own repairs, even though they could afford professionals; Olivia's workaholic tendencies that required constant vigilance to control; how to raise Lily with values, when they could afford anything. But they also loved with a fierce intensity, born from understanding how close they'd come to losing everything. Every morning, Ethan still woke early, but now it was to make breakfast for his family. Every evening, Olivia came home not to an empty penthouse, but to a daughter practicing piano badly, and a husband who looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. Sterling Global became a case study in business schools, proof that ethical leadership and financial success weren't mutually exclusive. The company's value tripled within 2 years of Olivia's reforms. Employee satisfaction reached unprecedented levels, and their charitable foundation, named after Sarah Carter, provided medical support for families facing catastrophic illness. Ethan often accompanied Olivia to board meetings, his presence a reminder that decisions affected real people with real lives. His perspective, formed from years of being invisible in corporate spaces, proved invaluable in humanizing policy decisions. On the anniversary of the first attack, they returned to Sterling Tower's ballroom. The chandeliers still cast the same prismatic light, but everything else had changed. The gala now raised money for families of single parents working multiple jobs to survive. Ethan stood where he'd once pushed a mop bucket, now wearing a tuxedo that fit perfectly, his daughter and wife beside him. Olivia gave a speech about transformation, about the power of unexpected heroes, about love that transcends social boundaries. But the moment that made headlines was when Lily took the microphone, her voice clear and strong. "My daddy taught me that being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about protecting people even when you are scared." He protected Olivia, and now they protect each other. That's what Love Island. The boy who'd crashed through the service entrance that night, hired by Richard and Damien to create chaos, had been a desperate young man named Marcus, promised money for his sick mother's treatment. Ethan and Olivia tracked him down after the trials, finding him working 3 jobs and drowning in medical debt. Instead of pressing charges, they paid his mother's medical bills and offered him a job at Sterling Global. He became one of their most dedicated employees, eventually rising to head of security, living proof that second chances could transform lives. His story became part of the larger narrative of redemption that defined the new Sterling Global. Richard Sterling died in prison 3 years later, alone and unrepentant. Olivia didn't attend the funeral, though she did pay for it. A final act of duty to the man who'd been her father in name, if not in deed. She and Ethan stood instead at Sarah's grave, Lily placing flowers while Olivia thanked the woman she'd never met for raising a man capable of such love. The circle of life and death, of loss and redemption, felt complete in that moment. Richard's billions couldn't buy him a single mourner, while Sarah's grave was surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by the love she'd inspired in her husband. The city sparkled below them as they stood on the observation deck of Sterling Tower, 5 years after that first fateful night. Lily, now 12, was inside at the company Christmas party, dancing with her friends from school who still couldn't quite believe her mom was the Olivia Sterling. Ethan wrapped his arms around Olivia from behind, feeling her relax against him in a way she never could have when they first met. The janitor and the CEO had become something neither had expected: partners, equals, family. The world that had once seemed divided by an unbridgeable gulf had proven more flexible than either had imagined. "Do you ever regret it?" Olivia asked, a question she posed sometimes when the weight of their unlikely story felt heavy. "Taking that bullet for me. Changing your whole life?" Ethan turned her in his arms, looking into eyes that had gone from ice to warmth, from isolation to love. "I didn't take a bullet for a CEO," he said, words he'd said before but that never lost their truth. "I protected someone who needed protecting. The fact that she turned out to be the love of my life. That she gave my daughter a mother again. That she made us a family that wasn't sacrifice. That was the greatest gift I've ever received." The Christmas party inside swelled with laughter and music, employees and executives mingling without the barriers that once defined Sterling Global. Through the glass, they could see Lily teaching Olivia's stern board members a TikTok dance, their dignity crumbling in the face of her infectious joy. This was what they'd built from the ashes of corruption and fear, a place where janitors could become heroes, where CEOs could learn to love, where a little girl's faith in her father could reshape an empire. As snow began to fall over Manhattan, dusting the city in white that made everything look new and possible, Ethan and Olivia held each other on that observation deck, their reflections in the glass showing not a janitor and a CEO, but simply two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way. Below them, the city pulsed with life. Millions of stories unfolding, but theirs had become legend. The night a janitor stood between a bullet and a billionaire, setting in motion a love story that proved courage isn't measured in bank accounts, that integrity isn't determined by job titles, and that sometimes the most extraordinary heroes are the ones pushing mop buckets through our lives, invisible until the moment they step into the light and change everything. The truth had indeed turned their whole world upside down. Richard Sterling's empire of fear had crumbled. Damian Cross's ambitions had led to a prison cell, but from that destruction had risen something beautiful. A family forged not by blood or money but by choice and courage. Ethan Carter, the single dad who'd just wanted to give his daughter a better life, had saved more than just a CEO that night. He'd saved a woman from a life without love, a company from moral bankruptcy, and proven that heroes don't always wear capes, sometimes they wear janitor uniforms and carry mop buckets, their superpower. Nothing more or less than the courage to say, "I'm not afraid of you," and mean it. Lily had been right all along. Her daddy was a hero. But more than that, he was proof that heroism isn't about being fearless, it's about loving someone enough to face your fears, about standing up when it would be easier to stay invisible, about believing that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose love over fear, integrity over safety, and family over everything else. The janitor who'd saved the CEO had become so much more: husband, father, advocate, and living reminder that in a world full of Richard Sterlings and Damian Crosses, sometimes all it takes is one Ethan Carter to change everything, one moment of courage to rewrite destiny, one declaration of, "I'm not afraid of you," to bring down an empire and build something better in its place. From shadows of power to the light of love,